It began with a document no one outside the ancient, high stone walls of Buckingham Palace was ever supposed to see. A single highly confidential royal decree, signed behind tightly closed doors by King Charles III himself, quietly transferred unprecedented operational authority and absolute control over the Crown's vast, multi-billion-dollar estates directly into the hands of Catherine, the Princess of Wales. At first, high-ranking palace insiders and veteran courtiers dismissed the urgent whispers as nothing more than exaggerated tabloid gossip or harmless chatter among the lower staff. But when senior managers and long-serving administrators at Sandringham and Balmoral suddenly began answering directly to Kensington Palace instead of Clarence House, even the old guard realized that something monumental, historic, and irreversible had just occurred within the British monarchy. This deep-seated decree was not publicly announced to the Commonwealth, it was not celebrated with royal fanfares, and it was certainly not dressed in the usual grand ceremonial language. Instead, it moved silently like a sealed military order passed through the dark, private corridors of power where the true fate of nations is decided. With one single pen stroke from a visibly weakened Charles, the fragile balance of power inside the institution shifted dramatically. Catherine, who was once seen by the public mainly as the graceful, supportive future queen consort beside Prince William, was suddenly positioned by the king as something far more commanding, permanent, and formidable. She had officially become the operational guardian of the royal estates, the very properties that symbolized the survival, wealth, and historical continuity of the monarchy itself. This administrative decision reached far beyond ordinary household management or routine diplomatic duties. It directly touched the duchy-linked financial structures, crown properties, and the sacred geography of the monarchy, places where family legacy is not measured merely in acres of land, but in historical duty, ancient memory, and absolute executive control. Senior officials and royal advisors were reportedly left completely stunned by how quickly and ruthlessly this new chain of command took shape. Instructions that had passed through the same traditional channels for generations allegedly began flowing toward Catherine's desk, and those who understood the subtle, unspoken language of the palace knew exactly what this meant for the future reign. Prince William, according to private palace whispers, had supported this legal move behind the scenes for months, not out of raw personal ambition, but as an act of absolute institutional protection. With King Charles's ongoing health concerns casting a heavy, unpredictable shadow over the future of the crown, the burning question inside elite royal circles was no longer whether the future was coming, but whether the future had already arrived early. Catherine's rise to this supreme position was purposely not loud, and that is precisely what made it so terrifyingly powerful. There was no dramatic press conference, no public confrontation with rivals, just a quiet, absolute authority settling over the grand royal estates like thick frost over ancient stone. Courtiers and senior aides reportedly began calling her the new guardian of the crown's sacred geography, a heavy phrase that carried both deep admiration and a chilling warning. Because if Catherine now held total operational control over the money, the land, and the staff, then it meant others had lost it entirely. And inside the competitive halls of Buckingham Palace, a sudden loss of control is never treated as a minor detail. It quickly becomes an existential threat, a bitter whisper in the dark, and the quiet beginning of an internal war that no one dares to name aloud. But the decree itself was only the visible part of a much larger story, because hidden deep inside the restricted palace archives was the real, undeniable reason Charles acted with such immense urgency. Long before King Charles placed his pen to paper, Queen Elizabeth II herself may have already fully anticipated this exact moment of vulnerability. According to whispered accounts circulating among former senior palace advisors, the late Queen spent her final years carefully preparing a secret continuity framework designed to protect the monarchy's most sacred assets from future instability, familial division, and internal ambition. At the very center of those private, late-night discussions was always Catherine. Reports suggest that Elizabeth's admiration for Catherine was never loud or theatrical, but it was unmistakable to those who knew them. It lived in the quiet approvals, the gradual invitations to exclusive state councils, and the deliberate way Catherine was allowed to stand closer to the heart of royal duty after years of unwavering discipline and calculated silence. While other members of the family fought openly for media attention, Catherine learned the power of ultimate restraint. While others chased sensational headlines across the globe, she quietly absorbed complex royal protocol, historical law, and statecraft. To a legendary monarch who had spent her entire life defending the crown from public chaos and internal scandals, that specific kind of patience was not weakness, it was masterclass preparation. Deep whispers now strongly suggest that before her passing in 2022, Queen Elizabeth may have personally allowed certain continuity guidelines to take shape around the future management of Balmoral and Sandringham. These were not ordinary real estate properties. They were the living, breathing symbols of British national memory, holding decades of family grief, historic coronations, painful fractures, and the heavy silence of past generations. To mishandle them during a transition of reign would not simply be poor financial management, it would be a historic betrayal of the bloodline. After the Great Transition of 2022, Catherine was reportedly drawn much deeper into high-level briefings that once belonged exclusively to the monarch's most trusted inner circle. Not dramatically, not publicly, but steadily and methodically. The palace does not always announce its true power shifts, sometimes it simply teaches them in silence. And according to veteran insiders, Queen Elizabeth saw in Catherine something exceedingly rare, a future queen who understood perfectly that absolute authority must be earned in silence long before it is ever used in public. Prince William, too, allegedly understood the profound structural significance of this preparation. Alongside Princess Anne, he is said to have formed a quiet, unbreakable understanding that the monarchy's estate network needed immediate ironclad protection before the next great royal transition arrived. Princess Anne brought the necessary historical steel, William brought the weight of future inheritance, and Catherine brought unmatched operational stability. Together, they represented a completely different kind of royal force, less theatrical, far more dangerous to their enemies because they moved entirely through legal paperwork, cold discipline, and absolute silence. Then came the sudden news of King Charles's serious illness, and with it, the terrible, crushing pressure of limited time. The strategic recommendations, once buried deep in private memory, reportedly returned to the surface of the king's desk. Charles, physically weakened but still acutely aware of the institution's extreme fragility, looked long and hard at what his mother had feared most, bitter division from within the family ranks. And suddenly, Catherine's name was no longer just a beautiful part of the distant future, it became the only logical answer to an immediate present crisis. That was why the secret decree carried such immense, shocking weight when it was finally executed. It was not only Charles's signature on the parchment, it was Queen Elizabeth's lingering shadow, Prince William's total trust, and Princess Anne's stark warning, placing Catherine firmly at the dead center of a legacy battle that had been waiting for its defining moment. And once those hidden legal recommendations resurfaced, the fierce battle inside the palace walls reportedly became impossible to contain any longer. What appeared publicly to the world as a calm, seamless royal transition was, according to multiple terrified royal insiders, hiding one of the fiercest, most brutal internal disputes Buckingham Palace had witnessed in modern history. Because the truth was, not everyone supported Catherine's sudden, absolute rise to operational power. Behind the closed doors of private dining rooms, estate offices, and tightly guarded security meetings, angry factions within the royal household were allegedly already fighting viciously over what this decree truly meant and who stood to lose their historical influence because of it. Reports suggest the first true shockwave hit when the decree's practical consequences began reaching senior advisors. This was not symbolic power, it was not a polite, empty gesture toward a future queen consort to make her look important. It directly affected millions in revenue, staff reassignments, restricted access, future planning ceremonies, and the quiet, daily machinery that keeps the royal estates functioning. The exact moment Catherine's authority became operational, the entire atmosphere within the palace changed overnight. People who had spent their entire careers moving through familiar, powerful channels suddenly discovered those channels had been abruptly narrowed, redirected, or placed under strict review. Certain high-ranking officials allegedly resisted this massive operational shift almost immediately, fearing that Catherine's new influence would permanently weaken older circles of power and reduce their personal ability to shape decisions around estate life and exclusive guest access. Inside the palace, a guest list can signal lifelong loyalty, a staffing order can reveal ultimate authority, and a single financial approval can expose who truly holds the keys to the kingdom. Queen Camilla's closest circle, according to heavy palace whispers, was reportedly completely blindsided by the staggering scale of Catherine's newly granted reach. The decree did not simply raise Catherine's administrative status, it appeared to draw a firm, permanent line between the reign that was slowly fading and the future that was actively forming, and that made the silence even more dangerous. No one wanted to admit there was an internal conflict, because admitting conflict meant admitting that the monarchy's most guarded, sacred spaces had become contested ground. Prince William, however, was described by everyone as absolutely immovable on the matter. Those close to the situation claim he saw Catherine's supreme authority as essential, not optional. After years of relentless public storms, media scrutiny, and painful family fractures, He reportedly believed the crown needed strict discipline before sentiment, and Princess Anne too backed these stricter protections, bringing her familiar steel to a moment already charged with extreme tension. Then came the quiet, unannounced reshuffles. Staff at multiple historic royal residences were reportedly reassigned, certain traditional approvals slowed to a crawl, and old privileges were suddenly reconsidered under a microscope. Nothing looked dramatic from the outside world, but inside the institution, every small adjustment felt like a major political signal. The future was no longer asking for permission, it was taking the reins. By then, top media insiders had begun hearing the same chilling phrase from more than one trusted royal source, that the future has already been decided. And for those who had built their entire career and influence around King Charles's current court, those definitive words landed like a final verdict. The immediate fallout from the secret decree did not dissipate with the setting sun. Instead, it intensified behind the heavy velvet curtains of Clarence House, marking the official commencement of what insiders now call the Battle of the Inner Courts. As Catherine's newly established operational team from Kensington Palace systematically arrived at the historic boundary lines of the sovereign estates, they were met not with open rebellion, but with a wall of cold, calculated bureaucratic resistance from traditionalist factions who felt their lifelong privileges evaporating into the cold British air. Every single requisition order, every financial audit into the ancient land revenues, and every subtle change in security clearances became a tense, exhausting negotiation. Senior administrators loyal to the older ways of court management deliberately delayed the transfer of critical files, using archaic palace protocols to slow down Catherine's rapid operational momentum. But those who expected the Princess of Wales to falter under this intense corporate pressure severely underestimated the quiet counteroffensive that had been meticulously designed months prior. Armed with the absolute constitutional authority granted by King Charles's signature and backed by the unwavering logistical support of Prince William, Catherine did not engage in loud arguments or dramatic corporate firings. Instead, she chose to implement what became known within the private corridors of power as the Iron Protocol, a quiet, surgical review of every operational tier within the royal network. Every expense was scrutinized under a financial microscope, every legacy contract was placed under rigorous review, and the informal, hidden privileges that had been enjoyed by certain extended family members and senior courtiers for decades were systematically evaluated against the cold standard of modern institutional survival. The palace, which had for centuries operated on a complex web of personal favors, unwritten traditions, and whispered understandings, was suddenly being sharpened by an unyielding, modern purpose. It was a calculated transformation that sent shockwaves through the entire royal household, altering the internal balance of power in ways that could never be undone. Behind closed doors, Queen Camilla's inner circle reportedly viewed this sudden administrative cleanup with deep, compounding apprehension. To them, the sheer velocity and unyielding nature of Catherine's operational rise felt less like a routine administrative adjustment and more like an early, tactical succession framework being enforced while King Charles was still actively on the throne. They recognized that the control of the sacred geography, the estates of Sandringham and Balmoral, was never merely about managing land or organizing hunting parties. It was about holding the ultimate keys to royal history, controlling who gained private access to the monarch, and shaping the daily environment around the crown. Rumors began to leak into the highly competitive press corridors of Fleet Street, subtle, carefully worded sentences buried deep within society columns, hinting at growing operational friction, deep executive disagreements, and an atmosphere of profound unease within the royal residences. These were not random leaks from lower-level domestic staff. They were strategic warning shots fired by desperate traditionalists who realized that their historical influence was being permanently dismantled from within. Yet, the more the external whispers grew, the more absolute Catherine's silence became. She completely refused to feed the growing media storm with any public reaction, understanding with perfect clarity that inside a leaking palace, complete emotional restraint is a far more devastating weapon than public outrage. Her power did not rely on media approval or public relations campaigns. It was already written into the binding legal parchment of the royal decree, and her strength lay in her absolute refusal to step backward even a single inch. Prince William's fury over these coordinated media briefings against his wife was reportedly immense and immovable. He did not see the resistance as mere palace gossip or harmless court politics. He viewed it as a direct, dangerous attack on the future monarchy itself, a malicious attempt to destabilize the crown during a period of acute vulnerability. He stood beside Catherine not just as a supportive husband, but as a future sovereign executing a vital defensive strategy to secure the long-term survival of their lineage. Together with Princess Anne, who brought her legendary, no-nonsense discipline to the table, they formed an unbreakable operational alliance. princess and reportedly delivered a brutal, unvarnished warning to the remaining traditionalist factions, stating clearly that while the crown could easily survive criticism from the external world, internal betrayal from within its own walls was an existential threat that would be dealt with swiftly and without mercy. The internal atmosphere soon evolved into what seasoned royal commentators described as a silent civil war, an intense struggle fought not with weapons, but with legal records, financial audits, and locked archive doors. Every person working within the vast machinery of the palace was quietly forced to make a definitive choice, to remain loyal to the fading arrangements of the past or to align themselves with the disciplined modern future that Catherine was actively constructing. As the weeks pressed on, the structural transformation became increasingly visible to those inside the system. Younger, reform-minded palace staff, who had grown deeply exhausted by years of internal factionalism and constant administrative uncertainty, began to rally enthusiastically around Catherine's clear, decisive leadership. They saw in her a rare operational clarity that cut through the ancient, confusing whispers of court politics, replacing chaos with absolute order. For the first time in modern memory, the internal machinery of the crown felt aligned with a singular, protective purpose. Yet, the emotional climax of this entire historic transition occurred entirely away from the eyes of courtiers and media cameras, during a profoundly private, late-night conversation between King Charles and Catherine at Clarence House. The king, visibly weighed down by the exhausting physical toll of his ongoing medical treatments and the immense psychological pressure of leading an institution under threat, reportedly spoke with absolute candor to Catherine about the heavy, painful burden of preserving the monarchy through an era of unprecedented global instability. In that quiet sitting room, surrounded by the portraits of past monarchs who had survived their own historic trials, the true future of the British crown was forged. Charles was not speaking merely as a sovereign commanding a subject. He was speaking as a father and a protector who deeply feared leaving the crown vulnerable to internal division after his departure. He questioned whether the ancient traditions could truly endure if every private corridor remained a battlefield for personal influence. Catherine, according to those familiar with the profound bond between the two, responded not with personal ambition or political maneuvering, but with a solemn, sacred promise. She pledged that the grand estates would never become instruments of vanity, internal rivalry, or private control, but would be guarded as a sacred trust held exclusively for the future generations of the nation. It was this specific perspective that solidified Charles's complete confidence. Catherine did not view this extraordinary grant of operational power as a prestigious prize to be celebrated. She accepted it entirely as a heavy, historic burden to be carried with duty and sacrifice. The invocation of Queen Elizabeth II's lifelong expectations during that intense conversation changed its entire emotional gravity. The late Queen's historical legacy still functions as the absolute moral compass within the royal household, the ultimate standard against which every major structural decision is judged. By aligning the decree with the secret continuity frameworks that Elizabeth had envisioned during her final years, Charles and Catherine were not merely enacting a new administrative policy, they were executing the final, unwritten will of the legendary matriarch herself. When Prince William joined the meeting later that evening, the generational pact was officially sealed. The future king and his future queen consort were no longer merely waiting for a distant destiny to arrive, they were actively stepping into the present arena to defend the monarchy from collapse now. In the immediate days following this profound personal understanding, senior aides noticed a remarkable transformation in King Charles's demeanor. A deep, visible calmness settled over him, as if an agonizing structural dilemma that had tormented his thoughts for months had finally been placed into the safest, most capable hands possible. The institutional gravity within the palace had officially shifted. More eyes were turning toward Kensington Palace. More major executive decisions were gathering around William and Catherine, providing undeniable evidence that the internal architecture of the next reign was already actively functioning long before the public would ever be invited to truly understand it. The quiet shift in institutional gravity within the ancient palace walls quickly solidified into a permanent structural reality, sending an unmistakable message to the global community that the British monarchy was no longer passively waiting for the distant future, but actively dictating its terms in the present moment. With the foundational protocols of the secret decree fully operational across the crown's vast geography, Catherine's comprehensive modernization drive began to bear undeniable fruit, fundamentally changing the very rhythm of royal administration. The Iron Protocol, which had initially been met with sharp bureaucratic hesitation from older palace factions, transformed into the new operational blueprint for the survival of the institution, sweeping away decades of administrative waste, personal favoritism, and hidden financial vulnerabilities. Every structural milestone achieved by Catherine's dedicated management team from Kensington Palace further isolated the remaining traditionalist resistance, rendering their archaic objections entirely obsolete against the cold efficiency of the modern framework. The strategic reassignments of senior staff at Sandringham and Balmoral were executed with absolute precision, replaced by a younger, intensely loyal generation of administrators who viewed Catherine not merely as a symbolic figurehead, but as the primary executive shield defending the crown from internal fractures and public chaos. This calculated sharpening of institutional purpose was not done to diminish the historical legacy of the past, but to ensure that the sacred foundations of the monarchy could withstand the heavy, unpredictable storms of a changing global landscape. Outside the immediate perimeter of the royal courts, as vague rumors of this internal restructuring steadily leaked into the international press, the public perception of the Princess of Wales underwent a profound and irreversible evolution. The global audience no longer observed her simply as the elegant future queen consort standing beside Prince William. Instead, they began to recognize her as a formidable, highly strategic guardian figure driving the institutional survival of the bloodline from behind closed doors. Royal historians and seasoned constitutional commentators quickly began drawing striking, highly detailed comparisons between Catherine's quiet, unyielding resolve and the legendary, lifelong discipline of Queen Elizabeth II. This widespread societal fascination only deepened the absolute authority of the secret decree, transforming an internal administrative policy into a grand public symbol of continuity, stability, and enduring trust. Yet, inside the restricted corridors of Buckingham Palace, this rising tide of public support was never treated as a reason for complacency, because the true architects of the new order understood that the ultimate defense of the crown required absolute, unceasing vigilance against any form of internal betrayal. Prince William continued to maintain an impenetrable wall of protection around his wife's operational domain, ensuring that every strategic directive issued from Kensington Palace was executed without delay or compromise. His unyielding stance made it completely clear to all remaining court factions that any deliberate attempt to undermine Catherine's authority would be treated as a direct, hostile assault on the future reign itself. Together with Princess Anne, whose sharp institutional steel continued to guide the transition through the complex labyrinth of royal law, they ensured that the administrative architecture of the next monarchy was securely locked behind iron doors long before the general public was ever invited to fully understand the gravity of the transformation. Then, as King Charles's visible calmness continued to reassure the senior ministers of the realm, the true, overarching purpose of his sudden historical intervention became brilliantly clear to those who understood the subtle, unspoken language of power. The king had not acted out of a sudden, reckless impulse, but out of a profound, far-reaching love for the institution he had waited a lifetime to inherit, recognizing with absolute clarity that a monarchy divided against itself from within cannot survive the brutal pressures of the modern era. His historic decree was a masterclass in long-term succession planning, a defensive masterstroke designed to neutralize internal rivalries and secure institutional solidarity before the great generational transition inevitably arrived. By placing the operational keys of the crown's sacred geography firmly into Catherine's hands, Charles had effectively built an indestructible constitutional shield around his lineage, ensuring that the ancient crown would not tremble or fall when the weight of the throne eventually passed to his son. As the final phases of the administrative review were successfully completed, a profound, historic sense of order settled over the entire royal household, replacing the anxious whispers of past uncertainty with a sharp, unified clarity of purpose. The silent civil war that had once threatened to fracture the private corridors of power had ended not with a loud, theatrical confrontation, but with the quiet, absolute triumph of discipline, paperwork, and strategic restraint. Catherine emerged from this intense crucible of internal court politics not merely as an admired member of the royal family, but as the indispensable structural anchor around whom the future of the entire British monarchy